I'm so happy I get to join sort of all the way from Georgia and be a part of this. I just prepared a couple slides, just give a little bit more background on the project, and we can do a question and answer. But also, I think folks should feel free to jump in at any time if there's any questions or comments that anyone has. So I just wanted to start with sort of, big picture about thinking about tundra ecosystems and why we might care about them. So we can define tundra as a biome that essentially it's too cold and the summers are too short for trees. So we think of tundra as occurring beyond tree line if you're climbing up a mountain, sort of once you get to the point where there are no longer trees, or as you're headed towards the poles, you get to a point where trees can no longer survive. And so from a distance, it can look like this really beautiful but sort of stark and harsh landscape. And the plants and animals here really have to be adapted to these incredibly cold conditions and really short summers to sort of do everything that they need to do. So, as I mentioned, tundra is one of the major biomes on Earth, similar to a desert or a shrubland. And if we find tundra, this is not a great quality map. I apologize in advance. But the reason I chose it was sort of the only one I could find that showed both you find tundra at the poles as well as at the tops of mountains. So if you see kind of areas that are highlighted in blue here, this is showing where we find tundra ecosystems. So we find them at very, very northern latitudes in the Arctic, at very, very southern latitudes, but then also at the tops of very high mountain regions, including sort of the Rocky Mountains in Colorado. Let's see. So this is just some pictures. I think a picture is worth 1,000 words. Kind of put this in perspective. This is one of our sites that is Arctic tundra. So this is the Toolik Lake Field Station in very northern Alaska. And this is relatively low elevations, about 2,500 feet elevation. And yet, because it's so far north, it still meets those tundra conditions where it's too cold and the summers are really, really short. And so you can see it's just a completely treeless landscape. So this is an example of Arctic tundra. But we also find what we call alpine tundra. So this is tundra at the tops of really tall mountains. So an example here in the Rocky Mountains in Colorado, we see, what looks like a superficially pretty similar environment, but here we're at 9,500 feet elevation to get those really cold, short summer conditions. So I mentioned that, when you look at sort of these zoomed out pictures of tundra, it can look like sort of this harsh, barren landscape. But, if you ever find yourself in a tundra ecosystem, I would encourage you to sort of kneel down, get really close to the ground, and take a close look at the vegetation there because it's really beautiful and fascinating. And this picture kind of highlights that how many different species there actually are in this tundra community, even though they're all pretty small and low to the ground. And that's because these tundra plants have had to adapt to really harsh climates. And one of the main ways that they do that is by growing just very, very low to the ground and staying small in size. So this is an example of 5 different really common tundra plants that you might see that all have this very similar pattern of growth where instead of growing taller like you might think typically a plant would do, these plants grow outward horizontally along the ground. So they're often called cushion plants because they look kind of like these little cushions on the ground. And if think about, well, why might this be an adaptation to cold climate? One is that if during the winter when temperatures really, really drop low, because these plants are so low to the ground, they're able to be covered with snow fairly easily. And snow provides kind of a nice insulating layer where the temperature is going to be pretty close to freezing, but it's not going to get much colder than that. So the snow can kind of protect these plants. And after snow melts, I don't know if you've ever been outside on a really cold, windy day, kind of the taller up you are, the more exposed you are to that wind. But if you kind of crouch down and get close to the ground, you can feel warmer and like you're more protected. And that's sort of what these plants are doing by staying low to the ground. They're more protected from that freezing wind. And so that's sort of where the common name for this plant in the center here, that is the focus of our study, and that I'm going to talk a lot about, comes from. So moss campion comes from the fact that, when it's not in flower, when it's not covered with all these beautiful pink flowers, it really looks a lot like just moss on the ground because it forms that kind of cushion plant. That's a little bit about tundra plants in general, but one question we get a lot. Sorry, I just got a message that my internet was unstable. Are you all able to hear me okay?
Yeah, the last like 10, 20 seconds was a little choppy, but we can hear you. We could hear you before and we can hear you now.
Okay, great. And why have we chosen this particular species to study for so long? And there are a lot of things that make moss campion particularly interesting. I'll just quickly go through a couple of them. One is that this plant, even though it's relatively small in size, it can live for hundreds of years. And we know that because we have monitored the survival of plants. We know they have high survival. And we also know that they grow extremely slowly. And so when we do find large plants, we're able to predict based on the growth rate how old that plant must be in order to have grown to that size. So one thing that's kind of fun about moss campion is it's actually been used by geologists to date geological features like glaciers or moraines. They use the largest sizes of moss campion plants that they can find growing in different areas and use that to understand sort of how long that substrate has been exposed. Another thing that's neat about moss campion is that it is really adapted to withstand very cold temperatures. In the winter, it makes antifreeze compounds in its tissue that allows the tissue to be able to withstand very cold temperatures. Great. Yeah. Thanks everyone for your patience. We figured out some technical issues. So the last point I was making about moss campion is that it's considered what we call a nurse plant, which means that it forms a protective environment that other species rely on to be able to cope with the harsh environment. And so, if you see moss campion, you'll often see other plant species growing out of the moss campion cushion itself. And that's because the moss campion leaves form this kind of tighter, warmer, and moister environment for other plants to grow. And this picture is kind of an extreme example of that. We can see 5 or 6 different plants growing out of one moss campion plant here. It's harder to see in a picture, but other research suggests that moss campion plants also are home to more diverse insect species and even soil microbes than you would find out in areas of the tundra outside of moss campion plants. So, the health of moss campion as a species is a really great indicator and sort of canary in the coal mine for the health of tundra communities overall. Another reason why it's so important to study what's happening in Arctic and alpine tundra communities is that they're being really strongly impacted by climate change. So, this global map here is simply showing average temperatures in the last 30 years from 1990 to 2020. And something that really jumps out is that the planet as a whole has been warming quite dramatically over the last 30 years, but we see some of the strongest warming in these Arctic and alpine areas. So, again, as I said, I think a picture is sort of worth 1,000 words. We can look at a glacier at Glacier National Park, one photograph of this glacier in 1911 versus a photograph in 2009. And we've seen just really profound changes to these environments. So, here, this is a glacier that has melted dramatically, that is going to really warm this immediate area. There's also new kind of substrate that plants could potentially grow on, but is also going to be quite a bit drier. Another challenge for tundra plants and animals in particular is that they sort of have nowhere to go as the planet gets warmer because they're adapted to extreme cold. And so, if we think about a plant species that maybe normally grows in a montane forest, as the temperatures get warmer, maybe that plant or animal could just move a little bit higher in elevation and be able to experience cooler temperatures. But for Arctic and alpine species, they're sort of already at the poles or at the tops of mountains, and so they can't really go higher in elevation or go farther in latitude. They're already sort of in the coldest ecosystems we have in the planet. So, climate change is posing a really big challenge for these communities. Not only is climate just changing very quickly in Arctic and alpine ecosystems, as I mentioned, these species are sort of already at the poles or the tops of mountains, so there may be nowhere for them to go. Many of these species, like moss campion, are very long-lived, which means that climate change may be happening within just one generation of these species. So, from the perspective of a moss campion plant that can live for hundreds of years, that temperature change in the last 30 years is essentially happening in the blink of an eye. And finally, these are organisms that are adapted for extreme cold and may just not be able to cope with warmer temperatures. So, I'll tell you a little bit about our long-term project here, where we have been really interested in how, moss campion and how it might be affected by climate. And so what we've done is study moss campion in 4 different regions that really span the species latitudinal range from north to south. So we have a site at Toolik Lake, which is basically as far north as the species goes. And then we have a site in the Latier Peaks Wilderness in New Mexico, which is as far south as you can find this species. And this project started in 1995. I was not involved at that time. I was 8 years old. But it was started by my collaborators, Bill Morris, who's at Duke University, and Dan Doak, who is at CU Boulder. And they took this picture in the Wrangell Mountains here in 2005, celebrating the 10-year anniversary of their data collection. And then I joined the project in 2015, and we're taking the picture of the three of us there in 2015 to celebrate the 20-year anniversary of data collection. So we have continued to do this study, at least some of us have continued to do this study every year from 1995 to present, and we have no signs of stopping anytime soon. And essentially what we're doing at each of these sites is we have plots where we have mapped and given a unique tag to every single individual plant there. So in this picture you can see sort of 3 moss campion plants, each of which has a metal tag with a unique number on it. And that allows us to go back to these sites each year and relocate the exact same plants. We can record whether that plant has survived another year, whether it's still alive. We can record its size to figure out how much it may have grown or even shrunk in size from the last year. And then most importantly, we record its reproduction. How many seeds has it made? And is there any evidence for new seedlings or new baby plants that may have grown up in the last year? At the same time, we have temperature and soil moisture loggers that are recording the climate conditions at these sites for us year-round. So I'll just quickly kind of show some pictures of these 4 sites. So this is the Toolik Lake LTR, which is in the north slope of Arctic Alaska. It's part of an international group of Arctic research stations. So we're looking, let's see, here we're looking down from the North Pole. Here's Toolik right there. And this is just a picture of what that research site looks like. So this is home to lots of people that do Arctic biology and Arctic research here. We also work in the Wrangell Mountains in sort of southeast Alaska. These are a bit higher elevation sites. Here's a picture of kind of one of our sites. You can see our tents there from a distance. This is taken from about how far away we hike from our tents in order to cook food as part of our grizzly bear safety protocol, which for me, I'm a coffee person and not a morning person, so having to hike up a mountain every morning in order to make a cup of coffee is always my least favorite part of the day. And this is a really beautiful place to work because you just look sort of the other direction from that picture I showed you. You can see the Kennecott Glacier down here in the background. And of course, in the summer when we're doing this work, that's about as close to sunset as we get. So I think we took this picture at about midnight. It doesn't get a whole lot darker than that. And then a little bit farther south, we do work at the Niwot Ridge LTR here in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. It's quite a bit warmer and drier, and of course much higher in elevation. This is another big research site where lots of different research groups, a lot from CU Boulder, but from all kinds of universities work up here. So you can see in this picture sort of different groups of research teams that are working up on the ridge during the summer. And then our southernmost sites are in the Latier Peak Wilderness, which are in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains of northern New Mexico. And these are our highest elevation, but also our warmest and driest sites. That's just another picture of one of our helpers that year, collecting some data for us. Okay, so I mentioned that every year we're relocating the same plants to record these vital rates of survival, growth, and reproduction. And that allows us to ask, sort of the overall health of moss campion. Okay, so what have we learned over 20 plus years of collecting these data? So I just wanted to show some pictures of what we can learn by monitoring the same plants year after year after year. So these are three pictures of the same plant in three sequential years: 2003, 2004, and 2005. And one thing you might notice is that it's not growing very quickly at all. It looks essentially the same size each year, although in 2004 perhaps it grew a tiny little bit. And in 2005, we see some evidence of what we would call dieback here, where some areas where some leaf tissue maybe got exposed to too much cold temperature and those leaves died. And so that plant shrunk a little bit. But one of the biggest changes we see is in the reproduction that this plant is able to make. So in 2003, it has four fruits, which is the part of the plant that holds seeds. So, okay, fairly good. 2004, this plant had a very good year. It made 18 fruits, so it made a lot more seeds than it had the year before. In 2005, on the other hand, it made zero fruits, so no reproduction whatsoever. So, this is just an example, but we see this throughout our project. Huge changes. In some years, plants seem to be doing really well. Some years, plants are doing very, very poorly. And so we want to know why. What's the difference between 2004 and 2005, for example? And so we can use our climate data to try to understand what might be driving this. So this is just an example of what our temperature data looks like for one site in 1 year. So we record the soil temperature every 4 hours, and that's what these points are showing over the course of the year. And we can use this sort of raw data to come up with aggregate sense of the climate conditions. So for example, we can see portions here where the temperature is very steady and very close to 0 degrees Celsius, so very close to freezing. And that tells us that this site is covered with a layer of insulating snow. We don't see any big swings in temperature, and the temperature is holding steady at freezing. And then as soon as that snow melts, we see a sudden increase in temperature and big swings from day to night temperature. And so we can use that pattern to know when the snow has melted at a site. And then we can also calculate things like the average temperature during the summer or the maximum temperature during the summer. So one of the things that we found is most important is the average temperature in July. And that's because July is a month when these plants are doing most of their growing and making their seeds. So the data that I think you all have had a chance to see for this tipping point puzzle is looking at that rate of reproduction for different July temperatures. And what we've seen is that if it's really quite cold, reproduction is fairly low. As it gets a bit warmer, reproduction actually goes up quite a bit. But now with climate change, we're starting to see more and more years where the temperatures are very, very warm. And what we're seeing is that reproduction doesn't just keep going up, there is a tipping point where all of a sudden now reproduction is dropping again quite low. And we also see a similar pattern if instead of average temperature, if we just look at when snow melts. So That's what this figure is showing for each of our sites. So the x-axis is like the day of the year that the snow has melted. So lower values would mean earlier snow melt in the year. And we see kind of a similar pattern where years where the snow melts really, really late has medium reproduction. And then if the snow melts out a little bit earlier, so you get a little bit of an extension to that summer, we see higher reproduction. But then as we start to get years where the snow is melting out earlier and earlier in the year, we see really, really low rates of reproduction. And so it's telling us a very similar story to what the temperature data is telling us. But the reason I wanted to also show this with snowmelt is to point out that in our southernmost site in New Mexico, for example, we have started getting some years where the snow is melting out really, really early. And in those years, we're seeing essentially zero reproduction. So a total failure of reproduction. So that is bolstering this idea that there are these tipping points that are really important. So that is kind of a big story that we've learned about this plant and how it's affected by climate and how it's affected by climate change in particular. And I just wanted to mention that with a long-term project like this, we're very much treating the scientific method as an ongoing process. So we get data, we're able to identify a pattern like this, but that always leads to the next set of questions, the next set of hypotheses, and that's why we're continuing to collect data to be able to address those. And so I wanted to end with just sort of a hint of what are some of the things we're thinking about right now, but we don't really know the answers to yet. And one of the big ones is, why is reproduction failing with really warm temperatures and really early snow melt? And there are two kind of hypotheses we have. We're collecting data to try to address them, but we don't know the answer yet. And they might both be true, or maybe neither of them are true. But one hypothesis is that if snow melts early and temperatures get warmer, these plants may start sort of ramping up their activity really early in the year. So they break down those antifreeze compounds, they start flowering, they start putting out fresh leaves. But then there might be a greater risk of getting these sudden frost events or these sudden like hailstorms that could really hurt these plants. So this is a picture of a plant that started and then it just got hammered. Aren't going to turn into seeds for this plant. Our other hypothesis is that these warmer temperatures might be disrupting the relationship of this plant with its pollinators in some way. So these are two active questions we're testing. We don't yet know the answer. Projects. So I know I talked for a bit more than 15 minutes and we had some technical problems, but thank you all for your attention. I'm happy to answer any questions or any comments that anyone might have.
Yeah, thanks so much, Megan. That was terrific. And there have been a couple questions in the chat, and I'm sure that other folks have some as well. But, Becky was wondering, is July the month that there's the maximum amount of growth across in all of the research sites?
That's a great question. Yes. So the research sites do differ a little bit in when the plants start growing and start flowering. but pretty much all of them, July is sort of that core month that they're able to grow a lot and reproduce a lot. And then, kind of some of the sites will be able to go into August as well, although often August is fairly dry. The snow melt has really dried up, and so that can sort of limit growth.
And Megan, you're investigating this right now. Have you seen any evidence that there's a change in the timing of the emergence of pollinators?
So this isn't data we ourselves have collected, but other researchers in the Rocky Mountains have noticed that pollinators are also becoming active earlier in the spring, particularly when temperatures are warmer or the snow melts out sooner. Um, but they seem to not be moving ahead quite as fast as the plants are. So there is some evidence that the plants are becoming active much earlier in the year, and the bumblebees, while they're still becoming active earlier in the year, it's not quite to the same extent, and so they may be getting mismatched. So I have a graduate student this summer who is hoping to do some observations of pollinators and collect some direct data on that for moss campion.
Cool. Thanks, Megan. And another question was what was the instrument used next to the plant? I think when you had the three images, 2003, 2004, 2005, what instruments were next to those plants?
Oh, great question. So we've been doing this project long enough that we've had some real technological changes in how we do this work. Now, rugged field laptops or iPads. In the early portion of the project, the data was collected into Palm Pilots, was collected with these photographs. So, what they would do is take a picture of the plant with a ruler that would provide a scale bar, but then to show what plant was in a particular picture, this is actually a calculator. So this is plant number 272. And so the person collecting the data would just type in 272 so that you could see it very clearly on a screen in the picture. Because, as you might see, the tag for the plant is not very readable in that picture. So it's very low tech.
That's great. Um, Another question just came in about the taproot of these moss campion plants. Has anyone studied the taproot, and is that even possible?
That's a great question. So we do know it makes a very long, deep taproot that lets this plant tap into sort of deeper water in the soil. It's difficult to study because the only way to see it is to dig a plant up, which is going to kill that plant. And because these plants are so long lived, we really think carefully about any plant that we're going to sacrifice. So we haven't done a systematic study of it because there's no real way to measure it without digging up all the plants in our site. Um, yeah, so that's the short answer to that question. We have grown some plants like in a greenhouse in clear containers where we can sort of measure how quickly the root grows down, but we're only able to do that for tiny little seedlings.
Megan, this is a question that I've seen come up in other workshops as well. I've reached out to you about it, but can you attribute the lower reproductive rate to other factors like maybe an increase in taproot or some other stress related modification?
Mm. Yeah, I think that's the big question is like what about the climate is causing that failure of reproduction, and there are a lot of aspects of the environment that could be changing. So part of that is that these aspects of climate are sort of correlated. Like years with really warm Julys also tend to be years where the snow melts out really early and the site gets dry really fast. And so we don't yet know if it's the temperature itself specifically that's causing this, or it could be, as you mentioned, that there isn't enough water in the soil, and that's why the plants aren't able to make more seeds.
So that's so we're kind of in thinking another question. Any ideas why there's this dip in reproduction rate? So warmer temperatures facilitating all of these other environmental changes potentially.
Mm-hmm. My guess is that it is stress. These are plants that have evolved under colder temperatures, and as the temperatures get too warm, not to get too technical about it, but plants are very good at sort of optimizing photosynthesis for a particular temperature. They'll have enzymes that function really well at a particular temperature, and that really is based on the type of environment that a plant has evolved in over really long periods of time. So when it gets too warm for a particular species, everything can kind of break down. Enzymes don't work as well, photosynthesis doesn't function as well, so the plant just isn't getting as much energy. Couple that with the fact that it's drier and the plant maybe isn't getting enough water, it can be really hard to have the resources to be able to even make something like a seed. But another aspect that could be happening is that perhaps the pollinators also are not as active or as available. And as I mentioned, in these, it's kind of counterintuitive, but in these warm and dry years where the snow melts out really early, these plants also experience more frost that they're not prepared for. I don't know if anyone's ever a gardener, but sometimes if you have a really early spring and things in your garden start leafing out and making flowers, and then all of a sudden there's an unexpected spring frost and everything sort of dies, that can happen in the alpine as well. So my guess or my hunch is that it's sort of a lethal combination of multiple things all happening at once.
Thanks, Megan. Another question. Did these DeMarche campion plants have mast years? Kind of like oak trees or apple trees?
That's a great question. Um, we don't believe that they purposefully masked, to the extent that you can attribute purpose to a plant. But like oak trees or other species really do, that's sort of a pattern that they've evolved, that they're going to have a year where everyone reproduces together, and then that the sort of goal of the overwhelm things that might want to eat those seeds. So like with oaks, lots of things want to eat acorns. So there's a benefit to making a bunch of acorns all at once, so that they can't all be eaten. We don't think that that's happening. Instead, it seems to be that there are years where the climate is good for reproduction and years where the climate is bad for reproduction. And we're getting more and more years where the climate is bad for reproduction.
Great. Thanks, Megan. Any other questions before we move forward? Thanks so much, Megan, for being here. There was a request for the slide deck, and I thought maybe we could chat about if you'd be willing to share your slides, and we can share the recording, the slides, and this could be an important resource for myself included, all of us here.
Absolutely. And we're Dan and Bill and I are super excited for anyone to be using this data in the classroom. And so please don't hesitate to reach out to us as well if there are additional types of pictures or questions or information that would be helpful. But I can definitely share the slides. And thanks so much for letting me join. It was really fun getting to chat with everyone.